Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome to the Embassy. Thank you all for joining us. May I acknowledge in particular Acting Assistant Secretary Patrick Murphy from State, Ambassador Solanara from Fiji, Ambassador Zakios from Marshall Islands, and Professor Alan Tidwell from the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, the co-host of our event today. I'm Rosemary Banks. It's my privilege to introduce to you the Right Honourable Winston Peters, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs. Minister Peters is serving his second term as Foreign Minister, having earlier held the portfolio between 2005 and 2008. He's been a long-term friend and champion of the New Zealand-US relationship. He's also been deeply involved in Pacific Island affairs throughout his long career, and he's now leading the government's Pacific policy reset. Please welcome Minister Peters.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa, good afternoon, and welcome to ambassadors and representatives from embassies here in Washington, DC, and the US government. And a warm welcome also to representatives from civil society, academia, and the business community. Particularly, we wish to acknowledge Professor Joel Hellman and Alan Tidwell from Georgetown University and for co-hosting this event, alongside Ambassador Rosemary Banks and the New Zealand Embassy. As you are all no doubt aware, New Zealand is a small but well-functioning democracy. In fact, looking extremely well functioning at the moment against some international comparisons. And we're located at the bottom of the world. We are small to be sure, especially when you see us on a map as an isolated collection of islands surrounded by the vast Pacific and Southern Oceans, in which has us situated some 2,500 kilometres from our nearest neighbour, Australia. New Zealanders are a proud people, proud of our history and full of pride about our historic social reforms in the 1890s and the 1930s. And just as Americans feel proud about their founding, with a purpose for the ages unfurled in the Declaration of Independence, and then codified in the Constitution that created the great American experiment in government, New Zealand is singularly proud of one of our first women achieving the franchise in 1893. The quintessential American writer and humorist Mark Twain noted when visiting our shores way back in 1895 that in New Zealand law occurs thus. To quote him, he said, "The word person, wherever it occurs throughout the act, includes women." That is promotion, you see. By that enlargement of the word, the matron with the garnered wisdom and experience of 50 years becomes at one jump the political equivalent of her callow son of 21. New Zealand also produces world-class athletes, excellent food, and wine products for export, and we have an innate desire to engage with the world. This latter characteristic is in equal parts a reflection of our geography and our national psyche. It has led us on a history of being a supportive friend and a plain-speaking people, which Twain also observed about us. It also means that now, as then, we consistently seek out good partnerships, which is also the purpose of today's speech. There are few relationships that can be better than New Zealand and that of the United States. We share a special connection, for we both retain democratic traditions and have stood firm despite the upheavals of the 20th century. Our institutions are founded on democratic values, respect for human rights, freedom of speech and assembly, and free and fair trade. Promoting and maintaining the rule of law is the defining feature of both of our political systems. Because of these common values and democratic traditions, it's hardly surprising that our global interests so often correspond, and that we have repeatedly worked together in times of international crises and in the face of major global challenges, and we will continue to do so. We recently celebrated 75 years, or the 75th anniversaries of Allied efforts to liberate the Pacific in the great campaigns of 1942 and 1943, in which the United States, Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific Island communities sacrificed so much. We fought together in World Wars I and II, and in Korea and Vietnam. Today, the New Zealand Defence Force is present in Iraq and Afghanistan alongside US personnel. While New Zealand and the United States work together on a range of global issues, our cooperation and like-mindedness is now coming into sharper relief in the Asia-Pacific, where the region is becoming more contested and its security is ever more fragile. It's New Zealand's view that the Asia-Pacific region has reached an inflection point, one that requires the urgent attention of both Washington and Wellington. And that is why we are here today. A nuclear-armed North Korea is one threat that has the potential to undermine security. New Zealand's diplomats and its defence force are engaged in support of US-led efforts to enforce UN resolutions, and the expectation that pressure will force meaningful dialogue. We're pleased that the United States and North Korea are back at the table. In the South China Sea, claimants in the various territorial disputes have acted in ways which challenge international law and norms. Tensions are escalated by artificial islands built in contested waters and which are militarized. New Zealand has consistently urged parties to resolve disputes peacefully in accordance with international law, and in particular the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Within this context, there's another area where greater cooperation is now timely, the Southwest Pacific. The significant focus of our visit to Washington is to share our concerns and enlist greater US support in the region closest to New Zealand. We are unashamedly asking for the United States to engage more, and we think it's in your vital interest to do so. And time is of the essence. New Zealand and the United States, we believe, have particular responsibilities in the Pacific as two countries which, through their geography, history, and people-to-people connections, are intrinsically part of the region. The United States, for its part, has been a major actor in the Pacific for well over 2 centuries. One could trace the beginning of America's Pacific journey back to Lewis and Clark's scarcely believable Corps of Discovery at the beginning of the 19th century, one that extended the United States' reach to the Pacific West Coast and from there across the Pacific Ocean. Just over 3 decades later, in 1838, half of the whaling ships visiting the Bay of Islands in New Zealand were American. In 1842, President John Tyler extended the Monroe Doctrine to Hawaii, and 2 years later, he signed the Treaty of Wanchia, which opened up Canton and 4 other ports to American merchants, some 128 years before Richard Nixon, in this historical sense, reopened China in 1972. At the same time as the accidental President Tyler was extending American interests in Asia and the Pacific, British immigrants had settled colonial New Zealand and signed the Treaty of Waitangi between Queen Victoria and the indigenous Maori people, and the treaty created a new society, one that celebrates today an uninterrupted history of democratic elections since responsible government began in the colony in 1854. Only 9 countries can make that claim worldwide. The Pacific has seen our country's histories and interests intertwined since these earlier times. You know, the Pacific was one vast canvas for the United States emergence as a global power in the 19th and 20th centuries. That canvas embraces the United States' special responsibility to the freely associated compact states of Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, American Samoa, Guam, and the Northern Marianas, all of which remain US territories. Hawaii is the northernmost part of Polynesia, besides being a US state. So the United States does not simply have interests in the Pacific, you are part of it. And New Zealand welcomes this recognition through House Resolution 1157, which reaffirms the strong commitment of the United States to the countries and territories of the Pacific Islands region. New Zealand is similarly in and thoroughly of the Pacific. We are the southernmost part of Polynesia. The first New Zealanders were Polynesians who embarked on journeys into the unknown, much like pathfinders Lewis and Clark. We have special relationships and constitutional obligations to the three Pacific realm countries, Niue, the Cook Islands, which are self-governing states in free association with New Zealand, and Tokelau, which is a massive expanse of ocean with 3 inhabited atolls, which remains a non-self-governing territory of New Zealand. And beyond our respective constitutional links that we share, New Zealand and the United States also share a connection as English-speaking democracies. Although, as any American from the Deep South who encounters a typically fast-talking New Zealander will attest, or as our respective governments in the mid-1980s found, we are on occasion also separated by our common language. But our Pacific bonds are strong and only getting stronger, as both countries possess fast-growing Pacific and Polynesian connections. To keep it simple, many of the last names on the Brigham Young University football roster for this year look seriously similar to the University of Auckland's premier rugby team. These names, like Latua, Kapisi, and Lotulele, are, after all, Polynesian names. For both of our governments, Pacific issues are domestic as well as foreign policy matters. The US Department of Interior is a major player in the Pacific Islands by virtue of the US territories and free association with the compact states. US Indo-Pacific Command enhances stability, helps to preserve security, and possesses the most capable forces able to respond to contingencies, including natural disasters. Ladies and gentlemen, more now needs to be done, and now. Working in partnership with Pacific Island countries, we need to ensure that all external actors have the Pacific Islands' interests in mind, including respect for the prevailing economic, social, and political connections in the region. New Zealand is acutely mindful of and honestly concerned by the asymmetrics at play in the region at a time when larger players are renewing their interest in the Pacific, with an attendant element of strategic competition. The speed and intensity of those interests at play are of great concern to us. Our eyes are wide open to this trajectory, and we know that yours are too. Given these developments, New Zealand has committed to a fresh approach to the Pacific Reset. It marks a significant shift in New Zealand's foreign policy and in our ambition and investment in the region. At the heart of our efforts is a focus on building deeper, more mature political partnerships with Pacific Island countries and supporting their independence and sustainable social and economic resilience. And I suppose at the heart of our efforts is to treat people as equals in partnership. The Pacific Reset also reflects New Zealand's response to the increasingly contested strategic environment in the Pacific, in which more external actors are competing for influence. This calls for close cooperation with Pacific Island countries, Australia, the United States, and other partners with historic links in the region. countries such as Japan, the EU, UK, and France to uphold values that we share and which we wish to promote in the region. Values like democracy, good governance, greater women's participation, and above all, the rules-based systems on which the region relies. New Zealand also acknowledges new actors in the region like China and welcomes all partners in the Pacific on terms that take account of the Pacific needs, where quality projects are sustainable and delivered transparently. We work with China in the Pacific and will continue to do so on those terms. New Zealand has significantly lifted development assistance programs in the Pacific, with over $500 million US in new funding over 4 years. We're also increasing our security contributions and better coordinating with our partners. New Zealand is substantially increasing both the quantum and quality of its diplomatic footprint across the region to boost our understanding and influence. That foundation is one we intend on building upon. And last week, my government announced an increase in the numbers of diplomatic and development staff it is posting in the Pacific region, as well as to the capitals of other countries we hope to work in partnership with. In the course of this year, the New Zealand government has also issued a revised Defence Strategic Policy Statement. And in terms of military procurement, we decided to purchase 4 new maritime surveillance aircraft P-8s to do our share to promote regional security. New Zealand is the second largest development donor in the Pacific Islands. Australia contributes 40% of support. The US assistance is similar in size to New Zealand's efforts, but is focused on those parts of the region with which you have constitutional links. Japan, France, and European Union are also significant contributors. We are saying today to the United States that we welcome your involvement, but ask you to join us in doing more, because nations with common interests and common causes can achieve more together than any of us can manage on our own. Given our sense of urgency about Pacific risks, we also point to the need for partners to support each other economically through free trade and by understanding each other's economic imperatives, because we can only achieve our collective ambitions by strengthening the economic engines that drive our shared desire to compete better, provide enhanced security, and ultimately to see the Pacific region and each other prosper. In terms of Pacific Island states, at this year's Pacific Islands Forum, members affirmed through the Voya Declaration an expanded concept of security in the South Pacific. It addresses the wide range of security issues facing the region, including an increasing emphasis on human security, environmental and resource security, transnational crime, and cybersecurity. Collective solutions to shared challenges in the Pacific require strong and vibrant regionalism with institutions that can convert political will into real action, supported by partners who align their efforts with the region's priorities. These are all areas where the United States has excellent capability and a track record in the Pacific. New Zealand encourages Washington to keep its definition of security assistance broad as it assesses its future efforts in the area. New Zealand welcomes recent announcements by, for example, the Trump administration, including announcements by Secretaries Pompeo and Zinke of new funding to strengthen maritime security, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and peacekeeping capabilities across the region, besides other support for training and equipment for Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and Tonga. And it was good to see the United States represented at the Pacific Islands Forum at cabinet level. In 2018, New Zealand, Australia, and US senior officials have stepped up Pacific-focused cooperation. This has already led to enhanced collective efforts with Pacific governments on infrastructure efforts to enhance maritime domain awareness, wider military cooperation with Pacific Island states, combating illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing, and other transnational crime and humanitarian and disaster response. There are also new opportunities for New Zealand and the United States to work together in the parts of the Pacific closest to New Zealand, such as Samoa, Tonga and the Cook Islands, whether in infrastructure, disaster resilience, or human development. As partners, New Zealand and the United States have a long history of answering each other's calls for help. In 1942, the United States came to the defense of New Zealand in a very direct sense. So then, New Zealand has regularly answered the call. Since then, rather, New Zealand has regularly answered the call when the United States has mobilized its friends in defense of its interests and international security more broadly. The US Marine 2nd Division Memorial in Wellington, New Zealand, placed in memory of US personnel who embarked from New Zealand to Guadalcanal and Tarawa and other Pacific battlegrounds, is inscribed thus: if you ever need a friend, you have one. New Zealand is now calling on its friends in the region to step up in support of the Pacific Islands. Our Pacific friends have made clear the many challenges they face, and they have identified their priorities, including climate change, which is an existential question for many of them. Ladies and gentlemen, time, tide, and political change wait for no man, no woman, and no nation. We need to act now. Working in partnership with our Pacific neighbours, we have a clear role to play in bolstering the capacity of Pacific Island countries and regional institutions to tackle priority challenges in the region. Working together, we can support the prosperity and security of the Pacific region and its peoples. This, ladies and gentlemen, will benefit us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those very clear messages about your view of the Pacific and what we need to do to work more closely together. So opening the floor now to a Q&A session, and I just remind you that we are live streaming, so bear that in mind for your questions. Okay, so just while you all get started, I'll ask the Minister, for the Pacific Reset, Minister, what's been the reaction around the region?
Well, if I start with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in London, absolute astonishment. Because the hardest thing to do in politics is find the money, as we all know. But abroad, beginning with Australia and elsewhere, it's had a seriously positive, resounding effect, because it sought to look at the circumstances as they were in late 2017, when the government was formed, and to see what had to be done with what were a range of alarming developments which hitherto, in the new government's view, had not been responded to appropriately. And we believe that we need to do it, first of all, ourselves, and to get out there amongst the rest of the world that is like-minded and alert them to developments which they could and should respond to with great urgency.
Come on, there's got to be a question. Right, gentleman there. Just bring the microphone.
Yes, sir. Mark Johansson from Boeing. Thank you for mentioning P8s. We are very happy to be building this for you. Let me take you in a slightly different direction. Space. You have a launch site in New Zealand. You're working in putting satellites up. You foresee what kind of vision or future that the country would be interested in space operations?
I have to tell you, sir, I'm not the expert resident Minister on that subject, but it has been a very exciting development set up in Hawke's Bay in New Zealand because of particular circumstances, and it is launched off with significant international resources, having been first funded by a New Zealand startup fund. But given the nature of its future capability, it obviously has now international investment seriously behind it. It is such an early time in its putative stages of development that we're all looking with interest, but we don't know where we'll all go to or lead to, excepting it's been wonderful to have demonstrated the capacity of New Zealand's youth, so to speak, in being able to be part of such a serious futuristic development. You'll have to ask the Minister for Science back home as to the wider part of the subject, but it is really quite startling what has happened and how quickly it's happened.
Good afternoon, Mr. Minister. My name is Christian Baskey. I'm a student at Georgetown. I'm curious, what are the main factors that might hinder the successful implementation of aid to Pacific Island countries? What are the main domestic issues that restricts development and things of that nature? Thank you.
Well, if you're talking about before it lands on the ground, it is the failure of political systems to understand that this is not charity. This is an investment in our own security, whether it be for the United States or whether it be for New Zealand or Australia. This is a serious investment which we neglect at our peril. Now, when it lands on the ground, our job is to ensure that there's transparency and accountability, and ensure that there are international systems available which we can volunteer to societies on the ground who can employ these agencies, such as, for example, an ombudsman, to ensure that they on the ground can demand of their leadership the proper delivery of the aid we're putting there. We're going to make sure of that, because we're actually training people who can be what you might call peripatetic ombudsmen available to other societies, rather than to have what you sometimes get as the kickback from the recipient, thinking that the donor thinks someone is cheating on them. There've got to be more subtle ways of getting to what you want, is transparency and accountability.
My question regards the security factor on the Pacific Reset. Are there specific items that New Zealand is looking for in the military part of the relationship that we can focus ourselves on, perhaps, at a working level? Thank you, sir.
I think a best summation of my answer to you, Madam, is I understand the import of your question, but our message is we need to ensure that there's less to compete against by being smarter now in those societies where possible competition can be localized and built. If you understand, do you see what I'm saying? Yeah.
A question, sir, about the Chinese approach and the massive amount of resources that the Chinese are putting into the Pacific. Realistically, how much difference do you think New Zealand's contributions can make in view of this huge challenge?
That's a very good question. First of all, we're not saying that our contribution can make that huge difference, but we are definitely saying that like-minded countries working together with shared contributions can do dramatically much more now. If you combine the United States, the EU, the UK, Australia, France, dare I say it, Canada, and Japan's resources, then you've certainly got the capacity to do a whole lot more. And the difference is, our funding and our aid is based on sound fundamental principles. They're not based on cheap loans. They're based on much wider concepts to do with the good of both the recipient and also the region. And in that sense, we can more than match any other competing or seem to be competing interests.
Hi, from the British Embassy here, Minister. Thank you for your remarks. You talked about New Zealand's reset on the Pacific strategy. Could you comment further on how the vision and values within that aligns to the US Indo-Pacific strategy that they've recently been articulating?
Well, in a way, it's part of it. And I'm so pleased that a representative from the UK is here, because given the UK's long history in the Pacific, and I know you're building 3 new embassies out there in the next few years, but just 1% of the UK's aid is about $250 million, which we could seriously help you spend wisely. Because I think I've got some of my Pacific friends here. We do because of our background, understand the Pacific. We're not boasting here. But our parliament and our cabinet has Pacific people in it, in greater numbers than anyone would ever thought. And so we are not trying to boast of our experience, but we're just saying, if you look at it, this country is deeply one influenced by its Pacific background. And dare say, I happen to be half Maori, half Scots as a background. And nobody's perfect, you see. You get a natural suntan and a desire to save money. But so many people have that background in New Zealand. Or, as they say, one after wants to get drunk, the other half doesn't want to pay for it.
So my question is kind of about New Zealand's commitment to security in the region. So as we know, New Zealand is one of the largest exclusive economic zones in the world, and as such is an important partner for the United States regarding security. But New Zealand only spends about 1.2% of its GDP on defense, and the Navy only has 10 ships. So is New Zealand looking to commit more to defense spending and security in search of a better partnership with the United States in view of the rise of China in the region, or?
Well, answering your direct question without the add-ons, because it could be interpreted in many ways, yes, we are, and we've already begun. But, we have, for example, an aid and involvement and contribution has many faces. We are, as a new government, dramatically increasing the size of our police force, and we're taking it up by an extra 1,800, which in our terms is huge, in the space of just over 3 years. And just 2 days ago, the 1,000th graduate since we became the government came out of the police force or graduated as a full constable. In that plan is also to use those resources around the Pacific in assisting Pacific law enforcement in Tonga, other countries like that, and in terms of fighting transnational crime, and using agencies and resources to get on top of the problem, which has many dimensions. So if you were to look at it, what is our contribution? If you start adding that in, then it becomes significantly huge against what you might call standard measurements. But I cannot announce the defense future for spending here in Washington, but we are stepping up.
Do you have another question? Yes, please.
Thank you, Minister. I'm your executive martial arts manager to the United States. And let me begin by saying it's a great pleasure to see you again. I think the first time we met, I was one minister for martial arts. I remember the trip we gave. But I want to associate myself with the very important comments you're making. First, on the need for greater involvement of like-minded partners, especially our friends, the United States, in efforts, joint efforts great challenge for people in the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific strategy. And the Pacific Reset is a crucial part of that, and you talked to that, and that's a very important part of this relationship and to assist Pacific Island countries. And one important message that was sent by the United States and we alluded to is the participation in quite some time by the United States by a cabinet member at the Pacific Island Forum. I think that's a very strong message of building of that partnership. My question is, the Pacific Reset and Indo-Pacific strategy, do you see the need for greater alignment on how these strategies have a real impact on addressing issues in countries, or are they doing that at the current, in the current state? Thank you.
So if you're talking about better alignment, we couldn't agree more. We want to ensure that we have such a significant dialogue that there is greater understanding of the way we can work together rather than all heading about it separately. And our resources will go so much further. But we need to have a proper dialogue as to the nature and character and shape of what we're dealing with, rather than to import certain constructions and understandings about cultures, which some countries, as you well know, don't understand. And we've got to have a better understanding of who we're dealing with. For what it's worth, so I can recall going to the launch of the Marshall Islands Shipping Registry one long time ago. Do you remember that? Well, I do. So we've been paying some serious attention for a long time. But you are right. We need to, how shall I say it? We need to have this dialogue and with great speed, and then get an implementation group together so we don't hit the gridlock and roadblocks of bureaucracy. It's needed now.
Mr. Welcome to Washington. I have a question. Looking at the United States relationship with New Zealand defense and security, but something that's tied to that is trade. And I'd like you to address the issue of where the opportunities that you see between the trade between the United States and New Zealand. And it's a two-way street. Being here in Washington, a lot of times I'm meeting with different government officials, not just our government, but foreign governments. It's a two-way street. What we can sell and invest in New Zealand, what is New Zealand looking for to sell and invest in the United States? And what my question really is there a priority right now with New Zealand of what they're looking for in trade with regards to the United States?
Yes, sir, there is. On the 14th of July 1984, a new government came in, threw out all the past economic prescriptions, and utterly opened up New Zealand's economy to trade from offshore without any tariff or impediment whatsoever. In short, they were of a mind that if we were to open up our borders to all manner of trade, then the rest of the world would have the decency to do the same for us. And they didn't, and they haven't. And the United States is one example of it. Now, I would have thought that the land of the free and the land of trade would understand that there's one example of their beliefs out there that has gone, in terms of its needs, unrequited all this time. And that's why we're in Washington right now in December 2018. That said, for example, we have a barrier against our steel and aluminium. The aluminium we produce in the bottom half, the very tip of the bottom half of the South Island, comes with an energy component 1/7 of New Zealand's energy costs. It is top-class aluminium of the type no one in the United States, no company produces it at such a high level that it's got a very, very extreme special market. But despite that, it is suffering a tariff barrier here in this country. And all we are asking is that there's got to be a logic to this, but if you haven't got a United States competitor with so that level of aluminium, why would ours be being how shall I say, handicapped by overbearing tariffs, so to speak? So I think if we get some common sense through there, that will seriously help. But in other areas, we don't subsidise any of our farmers. We're probably the only country that doesn't. We don't subsidise anybody in our country in that way. And all we're asking for is a chance to enter your market in a much more reasonable and a much more fair way for this fundamental reason, not just our own affluence, but we're trying to do a job where our stretch of our obligations in the immediate sense is nearly all of Europe and half of Africa, amongst isolated communities. And we can do a better job if our economy was stronger. And if no one can see the economic soundness of that argument, we'll have a look from the point of view of security and defence. That's why it needs to happen. And we're just asking for a fair go. I had a meeting with a former president of Korea, and I asked him, why won't you give us a free trade agreement? And he said, what's in it for us? Which is pretty rich since they were allowed to come into our market. Right? I was pretty desperate for an answer, and I said, Mr. President, when your country was fighting for its very existence in the 1950s, we came to your aid, and we're a small country, and when your currency collapsed in 1997, we were one of 9 countries that underwrote it. It's called respect and honour. He had the decency to say, well, we will have a free trade agreement. He put the press statement out the next day. I would like a similar result here in the United States.
Now that's a hard argument to carry. Maybe just one more question before we break.
I'm Wendy Dant. I work for the Netherlands-based Aquaculture Stewardship Council, and previously as the Marine Stewardship Council and Ministry of Fisheries, Ministry of Primary Industry in New Zealand. Thank you for mentioning illegal fishing. I just wondered if I could ask broadly, do you have suggestions that you could offer kind of at a broad level where New Zealand and the United States could work more closely on that particular issue, including links to transnational crime? And also, do you see any role for independent international certification organizations to help us with that?
The answer is yes to all three, and we're beginning that now in the sense that transnational crime agencies being set up in Samoa, and one also in New Zealand is working close with Samoa, making the information that they glean available to all Pacific countries to beef up our level of intelligence. So the answer to that is most certainly yes. On the question of illegal fishing, well, you know, for those Pacific countries, these are like gold bars coming through the water. That's the value to them, and it is critical to their economic survival. And our maritime resources and military resources can seriously help ensure that illegal fishing stops. And the surest way for it to stop is to grab them and nab them. I'm not going as far as the Indonesians did, where they blew 3 up, which is a rather serious warning. But we need to catch them and stop it, because and it's the very lifeblood of the Pacific we're talking about, and it's also got serious value. And if it's diminished by illegal fishing, then small islands like Tokelau's will lose a huge economic benefit. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the last question, I'm told. So look, thank you very much for coming along and giving the courtesy of hearing us. Can I just close by saying something? It is frequent for an audience like this to hear a message of urgency and concern, but I can tell you on this occasion, what we've had to say has got a real significant relevance. Thank you very much.